Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Hello and welcome to your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. We've got a packed show for you today. Our feature stories include a conversation with Wayne State Police Chief Anthony Holt on a new De-Escalation training center right here in Detroit. And later, Eater's Brenna Houck tells us about a popcorn company that's gotten burned thanks to some comments it made online.
But first, protests have spread in the burbs, pools are opening back up around the region, auto insurance companies are going to have to pay you back some money, a local PTO Treasurer allegedly embezzled an eye-popping amount of cash, and finally, Sven's got thoughts. There's headlines, there's a lot to do. Let's just get started. All right, let's start off the show with the fact that protests have spread from the city of Detroit and into the suburbs. The city saw its fifth straight night of protests on Tuesday, with the protest moving to the east side at Gratiot and Outer Drive. Neighbors were reportedly upset that the protest made it that far out into the city. A Free Press reporter was briefly detained, and a number of arrests were made after curfew. I'll put a link in the show notes to a time-stamped first-hand account.
Meanwhile, there were reportedly between 400 and 500 protesters who lined Big Beaver Road in Troy. The Detroit News reports that a 68-year-old Troy resident was arrested after he allegedly assaulted a female protester who was standing in an intersection because police apparently let the protesters block traffic for a brief period. The woman was uninjured.
Warren, a Macomb County suburb with a long history of racial issues, had a protest that started at 5 p.m. on Tuesday at 8 and Van Dyke.
I will also note that on Sunday, there were protesters lining the intersection of 9 Mile and Woodward in Ferndale, people holding aloft signs, encouraging traffic to honk their horns, show a sign of solidarity in that suburb.
Also, folks, in Grosse Pointe, and you might not think about Grosse Pointe, but that's actually an area of town that has gotten to have a very active NAACP chapter as of late.
Yeah, interesting. I would just point out, Jared, that I think this is an encouraging sign. I mean, a lot of people, frankly, will roll their eyes at the sight of protesters in places like Troy and see it as a nuisance. But you know what? That's exactly why it's important that these protests move outside of the city of Detroit. I mean, people in the suburbs, I think, frankly, see this as some kind of issue confined to the city of Detroit, but it's not. And we need to let people know that, if the sight of protesters makes you feel uncomfortable, think about what Black people are dealing with and think about, the issues that have led to the deaths of people like George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so on. I mean, we need to start making people uncomfortable and getting people out of their usual sort of comfortable rhythms to think about this kind of stuff.
Well, I can tell you from listener mail, Sven, we got some people who are uncomfortable.
Well, if you're a parent or you just equate summertime with sitting by the pool, we've got some good news for you. The city of Detroit and the counties of Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne have all rescinded their orders keeping public outdoor pools closed throughout the summer. So yes, friends, that means summer is back on. It's been rescued from the scrap heap. Hallelujah. The moves follow Governor Whitmer's executive order that we told you about yesterday. It allows outdoor pools to reopen starting on Monday. There are, of course, a few caveats. They have to be outdoors. They can only operate at 50% of normal capacity. Indoor pools are required to remain closed at this time. The coronavirus is, of course, still out there. We had 199 new cases reported on Tuesday and 37 fatalities statewide.
Sven, you are a parent. How do you feel about this?
The closure of pools was just so crushing. I mean, look, I'm still worried about what happens in the fall when the new school year starts. But not having pools all summer long was a tough pill to swallow, man. So, and frankly, look, they're just allowing pools to reopen. I think it still falls to the operators of the pools to decide whether this is going to be worth the trouble, trying to enforce 50% capacity. And, I'm sure pools mostly have their hiring and everything and their lifeguard training and everything, taken care of by this point in a normal year. So they're behind the eight ball. So, it probably doesn't mean that every single pool is going to reopen, but it's a hopeful thing.
Not covered under this order, but I believe I'm getting a kiddie pool for the dogs. The state of Michigan is ordering auto insurers to issue refunds or waivers to customers because they've been driving less during the coronavirus pandemic. Michigan's Department of Insurance and Financial Services issued an order that gives insurers until June 10th to submit their plans. They must include the proposed refund or premium waiver amount, how they determine the amount, and how consumers will receive the payments. Insurers will also be required to issue communication plans for consumers about the refunds and their options if their changed driving habits are long-term due to unemployment or working from home. Some insurers have already voluntarily announced plans to issue refunds or credits. Back in April, we spoke with Stephen Gersten of Michigan Auto Law. He told us the refunds are a fraction of what they ought to be giving based on the huge decreases in accident claims and driving activity. Of course, we will link to that in the show notes.
The Detroit News is reporting that the treasurer of a parent-teacher organization in Grosse Pointe is charged with embezzling $92,000. Most of it is from a fund for Monteith Elementary School, plus there's $1,000 from a millage renewal committee. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy has charged Quinn Keith Smith after a report was made to the Grosse Pointe Woods Police Department back in February. The thefts allegedly occurred over the last 2.5 years. We will put a link in the show notes to the Detroit News story.
On Daily Detroit, we like to look towards solutions instead of just reporting problems. So joining me on the line is Anthony Holt, the chief of the Wayne State University Police Department. Detroit and Wayne State will be the headquarters of a new de-escalation training program that will not only serve our area, but aims to spread across the country. Chief Holt, welcome to Daily Detroit, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So I noticed that you all have established a headquarters for the National De-Escalation Training Center. First off, what is that for people who wouldn't know?
Well, de-escalation is an approach to really to get right down to the very basic of it. We want to minimize adverse outcomes when we deal with the community and the public. What it is an attempt to increase the probability of really a peaceful compliance. In other words, before we come to a use of force, we want to do a de-escalation. This is not a typical one-size-fits-all de-escalation where we say, okay, we'll let the person vent, and we'll be patient. We're trying to align with his problems and say, okay, this is what we have to do. This approach is really based on personality assessments. There are 4 main personality assessments and about 26 subsets from there, where we're actually looking at the person as the individual to see what the issue is and how we could come to a successful solution. Example, we get a traffic stop. We don't want to just walk up to you and say, give me your license. We see a violation. We heard you did this. Get out the car now. We don't want to do that. We want to have a different approach. When we talk to the person, we look at what we consider his personality, or we look at him as an individual, and we base that approach based upon what we see there.
There's pretty high standards for becoming an officer with your group. How important is additional training when it comes to policing?
Well, training is ongoing in police work, and I think in law enforcement. Our department, we require a degree before we even talk to you and we can hire you. But then place on that, the training has to be ongoing. You can't just say, okay, we hired you, you have a degree, we send you to a police academy, now you go out there. No, training is ongoing. It's crucial, very, very crucial. And I think you see that when we don't really hire officers who stay here 20 to 30 years. We hire officers who get a lot of training, they work on advanced degrees, then they go further off and advance their law enforcement career. That is what I like. Then you get an officer who's engaged, he wants to learn, he wants to interact with the public, and he wants to move on and do bigger things.
So how did it come together that this was going to happen here in Detroit at Wayne State?
Actually, I was approached about 2 years ago about this new concept of de-escalation. We've always had training like verbal judo, how to talk a person down, but that was a one-size-fit-all. This person approached me by work he was doing at Florida University. He said, we have a new concept that's based on a personality and module, and it has these sets, very technical training. And I said, oh, let's look into this. And then a year later, we had further discussion. We said, let's bring this to our department. So in January, I sent 2 officers to Texas to go through a structured training, intense training. They came back, and they were very, very impressed with the training. Not only did they go down to do the training, they went to assess this training to see if it will fit with what we do here in law enforcement. And based on that, the group came here in early March, and we started training probably the first 2 groups of officers here. Then, unfortunately, the pandemic hit. And with all the state guidelines and procedures, we had to shut down. And hopefully we're going to resume this within 2 or 3 weeks. We do psychological testing, so officers can understand what their personality type is. Then we do intense classroom training. Then we go into scenario-based training based on the actual encounters that work we have with citizens. Now, we actually going to bring a Milo simulator here where we could create training opportunities and where officers will walk through this training in real time.
So how available is this training going to be for? Is this just for the state? Is it how wide does this serve?
The first thing on our agenda is to train all the officers in our department. And then being a headquarters for the national training, we're going to open it up for law enforcement. It also has a business module. It can work also on hospital personnel, and that's strictly for law enforcement. But we're concentrating on law enforcement module here. And then it's going to be opened up. That's why as regional centers are going to be opened up to make it easier for people or those in law enforcement to assess this type of training.
Wow, that's really cool. It's good to hear about solutions like this. How excited are you personally about having something like this here and being a part of it?
Well, I go through a lot of requests for trainings. I look at a lot of different training opportunities that are out there for the department. But this one I thought was a real solution to minimize conflict. And you get the officers to buy into this. You get the community to buy into this. And I am very excited about this. I think we have something that's very workable. The first thing of all training, we send officers to all type of training. And I want this to be a training where the officers actually buy in and says, I want to do this.
Yeah. I mean, it's always better to teach somebody who is an excited learner, right?
Absolutely. That's the only way. If you don't buy into this, that minimizes conflict and really looks at the citizen as a person, an individual, then maybe you need to turn in your badge. Maybe this is not the place for you to work.
Well, Chief Holt, thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And thank you for talking to us about this new training center.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you.
Joining me on the line is Brenna Houck from Eater Detroit. So the latest story, and I was going to start with a pun as I do, but I know the audience would groan about what's poppin' as the Detroit Popcorn Company is facing a huge online backlash right now. And it's also apparently resulted in losing some business. Brenna, you've been up and down on this story following it. What is going on out there?
Yeah, so as we all know, there have been nationwide protests by activists highlighting police brutality across the nation, spilling over into everything. And people have various opinions, and they often express those online. And that is sort of what happened here with Detroit Popcorn Company. The owner, Evan Singer, was seen online reacting to what was apparently a video of a Target being looted, and people took screenshots of a comment in which he stated that they wonder why they need knees in their necks. And that has caused a lot of anger. People, initially spent a lot of time trying to figure out who Evan Singer was. His handle on Facebook was Even Sangria. And then as this social media backlash started to spread, people went to the Detroit Popcorn Company Facebook page and they started messaging. And the person who responded claimed that Even Sangria wasn't the owner, but was in fact a longtime customer, which, as it turns out, was not true because Evan Singer has come out and told Fox 2 that he did write those comments. And then there are also a lot of screenshots of other conversations that people who were angry with Evan Singer took, of conversations with him expressing their anger and displeasure with the comment that he made, in which he seems to, reiterate that he thinks that protesters deserve a knee on their necks for damaging a business. So it's caused a lot of fallout, and I can talk a little bit about that. There was a lot of pushback initially against the company itself. They started by taking down all of their social media accounts, and they were not responding to calls by media, including myself. And then because Detroit Popcorn Company is a fairly large and established company, it's been around since 1923, I want to say. They provide popcorn to a lot of different companies around the city, including Quicken Loans. So some employees at Quicken Loans tagged Quicken in this, sent the post to Quicken, and Quicken has since denounced the statement that Singer made and has pulled their business publicly from them. The Detroit Zoo has also pulled their business from Detroit Popcorn Company. And it's also created a little bit of complication, though, for other popcorn businesses in the area. Poppin' and Mixin' Kettle Corn was very concerned because they started to receive similar backlash by people who were getting confused between Detroit Popcorn Company and the Detroit Kettle Corn truck, which is run by Poppin' and Mixin' Kettle Corn. And so they've had to issue statements. The owner of another Black-owned business, Motor City Popcorn, is a customer with Detroit Popcorn Company. And I spoke with the owner last night. He said that he had spoken with the owner of Detroit Popcorn Company, and Sean Combs said he doesn't really know what to do because Detroit Popcorn Company supplies so much of the popcorn and different equipment that popcorn companies need in this area. And he said they sort of have a monopoly on that. So he's trying to reevaluate his business and how to move forward in this situation because he's not sure that he can continue to buy from Detroit Popcorn Company. So people are making their voices heard, definitely.
Well, and there's so many webs with this. I don't think I realized just how big Detroit Popcorn Company was, or that it provided all of that background support for other companies.
Yeah, I think it's easy to think, popcorn, but, packaged popcorn, a lot of local organizations use it at, fundraisers and events, and teachers buy it for students as rewards. And, it's an affordable thing that a lot of people want to eat, and it's, marketed as being fun. So Detroit Popcorn Company has a surprising amount of influence, and a lot of people know what it is.
Yeah, and I think, kind of to close, it feels like there is a really big lesson to learn here for purveyors, for business owners, because it seems like if you're involved in things, depending on how you come out and how you say things, it can really have an impact in your business. I know there are multiple stories floating out in the world right now around food products, food businesses, restaurants, and, Brenna, I don't know what your thinking is, but I tend to think that it's kind of like owners need to be really smart about how they interact with the public and just in general, not just in these times.
I think that in general, everyone, not just owners, everyone needs to be smart about how they interact and engage with social media and express themselves. And I think particularly right now, things are getting really heated, and it's important to sit back and think about, why protests are happening the way that they are.
Yeah, for sure. Brenna Houck, Eater Detroit, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
In another twist, after we finish this conversation, Fox 2 reports that the previous owner of the Detroit Popcorn Company came out of retirement and bought the company back from the embattled president after the racist posts were published. David Farber is the guy's name, and he announced Tuesday that he bought the company back from Evan Singer. It's the person we've been talking about during this segment. I will put a link in the show notes to that story. Sven, I know you've been sitting on some thoughts of the news over the past week. We share a lot of the same podcasts and things we listen to. And I'm curious to see what you think.
Yeah, look, this has been a really heavy last week or so here in the United States. We are living in unprecedented times in some ways, I think. I've been just watching the news and listening to a lot of podcasts, including Make Me Smart, which is kind of the side project podcast from Kai Ryssdal and Molly Wood, who normally do the podcast and public radio show Marketplace,
of which I am a big fan of, and I've been a big fan of Molly for many years. Both of them are just so bright.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I saw Stephen Colbert Late Show last night, and he said in his opening monologue, I'd never thought I'd live to see, the day when a global pandemic was not the top story anymore. And, one of the things that Molly Wood was talking about on the Make Me Smart the other day was that George Floyd, the black man who died in, literally under the knee of the police officer in Minneapolis, sparked all the protests around the country, is really just sort of the latest embodiment in a string of calamities that have just disproportionately affected black people, right? The coronavirus pandemic itself disproportionately has affected African Americans. We've talked about that. The economic fallout, this quasi depression that we are probably now experiencing and heading into has disproportionately affected black people. Police brutality has been going on for years now, is disproportionately affected black people. And one of the points that Molly Wood also made is that, the term essential workers has essentially become shorthand for people of color, right? These are the people that we have determined we're willing to, make them go back to work so that we can essentially, continue to get Big Macs from the drive-through window or whatever.
Well, and the workers that we keep saying we need the most, oftentimes we're paying the least.
Right. They're just, it's the Amazon warehouse employees filling orders for shipments so that, people who are comfortable enough can sort of, feel uninterrupted. And it just strikes me that this frustrating feeling strikes me that nothing ever seems to change, right? You spoke with Ken Coleman, the great Detroit historian, the other day on the show, and you guys were going all the way back to the 1943 race riots in Detroit. And of course, couple decades later, in 1967, the city erupted into flames in another racial uprising in the city. You just get the sense sometimes that nothing seems to change, and it's hard. I think people in America, we are proud of our country, and we think that we're the shining city on the hill and everything. But we've, in so many ways, and I think we're seeing this in stark relief now, we're failing to live up to our ideals, right? We have a lot of problems, and they're in stark relief right now. I had a weird experience the other day. There was a black woman. I'd never seen her before. She was walking down the sidewalk in front of my house, and I had this impulse that, I wanted to go up and just give her a hug and just sort of, like a gesture of hey, I see you. I'm sorry. Whatever, if there's anything I can do. And, quickly, of course, I realized you can't do that right now because of, we're still living under this pandemic, right? So I was also thinking about all this stuff when I read a piece by Ezra Klein on Vox, and it's headlined "America at the Breaking Point." And one of the things he talks about in there, and I've heard this from a number of people, I've seen this comparison made in a number of places, that what we're living in and experiencing right now is a lot like the 1960s, right? Which, of course, was a time of incredible social upheaval. You had the Vietnam War, there was the Civil Rights era, We saw a U.S. president assassinated, right? John F. Kennedy. His brother, Robert Kennedy, was killed a few years later. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Malcolm X. And somebody even I saw the comparison made about the recent SpaceX rocket launch, right? That here we are watching astronauts launch into space on these rockets and sort of toggling between images of that and cities on fire, right? It's like the similarities are sort of uncanny in that way. Going back to Ezra Klein's piece, though, he argues that we were much better equipped as a country to respond to these crises back then. And let me read a segment that he wrote in his piece. He writes, "The 1960s are here again. We are at risk of coming apart. But this is a political system less practiced at holding us together, less capable of finding calm amid storms. Our divisions define our parties and our institutions crack under the strain. Congress can't resolve small disputes, to say nothing of fundamental fractures. And our president is plainly eager for the storm to come. He does not know how to fight a virus, but he knows how to fight his countrymen." End quote.
I mean, that's powerful, and it makes me think of a tweet that I reshared from one of the technical operations folks at NPR, who basically talked about how that NPR has long provided tactical gear to reporters in war zones, and now, with a picture of an Army helmet, a protection helmet and the NPR logo on it, that they're providing the protective gear that they usually send to folks in Afghanistan and wars. They're sending it to D.C.
Yeah, like to walk out the front door of their office. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. So, and staying on that idea of the news media, a couple of years ago, actually shortly after Donald Trump's election, I started watching, I became really interested in history, right? Because I think I felt compelled to figure out, like, how did we get to this point in time? Like, we just elected Donald Trump as president. Like, how did this happen? Like, I wanted to put it into some kind of context and help, try to understand this. So I started watching, CNN has this series of documentaries on the decades, right? There's one on the 60s, there's one on the 70s, the 80s, so forth. And I was watching the ones on the 60s, I was watching the ones on the 70s, and specifically the episode on Richard Nixon and Watergate, right? And one thing that I noticed that became really clear to me is that back then the media was much more sort of concentrated and nowhere near as sort of diversified as it is now. I mean, you basically had the three major broadcast news outlets, and, you had national big publications like the Washington Post, obviously, which did great work during Watergate, the New York Times. But outside of that, in terms of outlets covering something like the White House, you didn't have a whole lot. Maybe, some local papers would have White House bureaus and things like that. But, nowadays it's much easier. It's never been easier to access news, right? That's, you go online and you get it for free, and you can download podcasts for free and listen to the news on demand whenever you want it. It didn't used to be like that. But what really stuck out at me was that Americans trusted the news media in the Watergate era in a way that they no longer do. People listen to Walter Cronkite and some of the other big voices on broadcast media, and they read the Washington Post and they believed it. Those reports helped turn the tide of public opinion, and they turned it against Richard Nixon in a way that I don't think the news media nowadays is capable of doing. I mean, there's been a lot of terrific work by journalists in the Trump impeachment trials and stuff, but it didn't work, and it didn't necessarily turn the tide of public opinion strongly enough, and specifically, the Republican Party, which Nixon lost his own Republican Party back in the 70s. You have to remember that.
Well, I mean, there's some fundamental changes between then and now, and I think one of the things managing social media and doing things here with this project, it's that people nowadays tend to. It used to be that other ideas would seep through if you didn't agree with somebody, or if you had a worldview. Because look, people have been stubborn since the beginning of people.
For sure.
Right? But back then, other ideas would kind of start to leak into you, whether they're ones that you disagree with, whether they're on the left, whether on the right. Mm-hmm. Here, there's so much media siloing in how people consume things, and people are all over the place. They're not just watching TV. I mean, look, this podcast is competing for attention with TikTok, which is competing for attention with, Newsnet, with TV news, which is competing with attention for everything. So,
Facebook, Instagram, yeah.
Right. And algorithms pump us exactly what we want to see.
Yep.
And that's how they make their money. And I think we cannot discount the impact of algorithms and selective content in the world, because, when you have that one feed from CBS or, thinking about Cronkite or Morrow or all those guys, that was one feed where it's like, this is what we're all seeing communally. Yeah. Now you open up Facebook, you open up Twitter, you open up all these things.
Different people see different stories. Yeah. So between that and sort of our completely divided, dysfunctional government, that's what, Ezra Klein was writing, it makes this moment so terrifying. Like, we are so much worse equipped to handle this crisis now. In the meantime, Trump is absolutely stealing a page from our 37th president, Richard Nixon, in kind of becoming, he even said, I'm going to be the president of law and order here and everything. I mean, Nixon, was elected largely, by sort of claiming that mantle and, coming out of the 60s with all the public protests and the Democratic convention in Chicago in 1968 and all the calamity that happened there and everything. Americans were fed up and they wanted to see, some normalcy returned, and he kind of capitalized on that. I think the big question is, are we going to see a repeat of that, in the 2020 election? Because, look, we know that there's always a backlash, right? We've been living, I think, a backlash. I would argue that the Trump presidency has basically been like a 4-year-long backlash to the Obama years. And I mean, the question is, are we going to see a repeat of history yet again?
I mean, that is a real question. And I every day we do this, this is a hard time. I mean, I really wish we could go back to just like, let's talk about openings and closings and, booze with Devin. You know what I mean? Like these are things that, like, I think we can hold these things in two spaces that, like, yes, we want to go back to that part, but also fundamentally there has to be changes in our country. You think about the 1960s, things didn't stop until problems were addressed. And
Mm-hmm.
right now, we don't have ways to address those problems. You have a few things maybe starting in the Congress, but there isn't like a major piece of legislation that's, got wings behind it right now. And what worries me is I don't know where this ends. Like, I don't see where this ends yet in a way that isn't terrible. All right, on that note, we are done for today, if not just done with everything. Of course, so done. Of course, we will be back here tomorrow with your Daily Detroit. By the way, just wanted to make a quick little plead. If you can, I know these times are tough, we are member-supported media. It is crucial to keep Daily Detroit running and fiercely independent. You can join our wonderful members on Patreon at patreon.com/dailydetroit. Stickers are starting to be on the way, coming together. Also, I'm excited as soon as we get an update on the bourbon glasses, that will be a great thing. So even if we're still socially distanced, we could all have a drink together on Zoom or something like that. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit.
Yes, thank you indeed. I'm Sven Gustafson, and until next time, take care of each other, everybody. It's more important than ever. It's the only way we're going to get through this is together.